She was 7 months pregnant. Her ankles were swollen. Her coat barely closed across her belly. And the company car carrying her through the outskirts of Seoul at 11 o'clock at night was moving north, away from the city, away from the lights, toward an unfinished construction site that no one had worked on in 4 months. Seo Ha-yeon placed both hands over her stomach and felt the 3 small lives shifting inside her. 3. The doctors had confirmed it at 20 weeks, and Jae-won had not smiled. He had simply nodded, as if confirming a number in a ledger. She had told herself it was his way. She had told herself many things. She was done telling herself things now. The driver did not look at her in the rearview mirror. That was the first signal. Drivers always looked. A glance, a professional acknowledgement. This man had not once turned his eyes toward her since he collected her from the house, and in the careful, trained part of Ha-yeon's mind. The part her father, the professor, had built in her by reading her Chekhov and telling her. The gun that appears in the first act always fires in the third? That silence was louder than any alarm. Her husband had told her through his assistant that there was a contract dispute, that her signature was required, that it couldn't wait until morning. Her husband had stopped arguing with her 4 months ago. Not because the peace had arrived, but because the decision had. She understood this now, in the way that a person sometimes understands something only when the understanding can no longer save them. Jae-won did not argue with things he had already resolved. He had resolved her. The car stopped. The construction site rose in front of her. Half-built concrete towers standing against the night sky like broken teeth, surrounded by chain-link fencing and dark and absolute silence. 2 men stood waiting at the entrance, and behind them, in the coat and sealed expression she had known for 20 years of Seoul's underground, stood Park Dong-chul. He didn't look at her either. That was the second signal. Dong-chul, who had attended her wedding, who had once slipped her an umbrella in the rain while her husband's car drove past. Dong-chul was looking at the ground. She was walked inside. She was walked down. And then a reinforced steel door closed behind her, and the lock engaged, and Seo Ha-yeon was alone in the dark, 7 months pregnant, in a sealed concrete room beneath a building that no one was supposed to be visiting. She stood there for a very long time. Then she found the light switch, and when the emergency bulb came on, she saw what was waiting for her in that room, and she understood with absolute and devastating clarity 2 things simultaneously. The first, that her husband had arranged her death. The second, that someone had arranged her survival. If you have never heard a story like this one, stay, because what Seo Ha-yeon did next in that concrete room, alone, at 7 months pregnant, is not a story about a woman who was saved. It is a story about a woman who saved herself, and then, 3 years later, burned everything her husband had built to the ground. You are watching Kalov, and this story does not end until every single person responsible answers for it. Now, let's go back to the beginning of the night that changed everything. Kang Jae-won was not, by nature, a dramatic man. This was the first thing that anyone who knew him would tell you, and it was also the most dangerous thing about him. Dramatic men give warnings, they escalate. They leave traces of intention in their wake. Raised voices, slammed doors, the petty theater of a person who wants you to know what is coming. Jae-won had none of this. He was the chairman of Kang Industries, the public face of Seoul's most feared criminal syndicate, and he had reached that position not through passion, but through architecture. He built systems. He built hierarchies. He built the precise conditions in which outcomes he required became inevitable, and then he let those conditions do his work for him. He had built those conditions around his wife for 3 months. Ha-yeon had married him at 29, believing, as people who fall in love with certain kinds of men always believe, that she had seen past the architecture to something warmer inside it. She came from a family of modest academics. Her father taught literature. Her mother played piano. She had grown up in a household where truth was recorded because it was respected, and where careful observation was considered a form of love. She had brought all of this into a marriage that had no use for any of it. For 3 years, she had documented, not out of suspicion, but out of habit. Conversations noted in a private journal. Dates and anomalies flagged in the personal files she kept on an encrypted drive. Financial peculiarities she had noticed on documents that passed through the household. She had never intended it as protection. It had simply been the way she understood her life. It would become the weapon that ended his. But that was 3 years away. On the night the car drove north, Ha-yeon had stood in the illuminated concrete room and looked at what Dongchul had left her. 2 sealed containers of water, a box of protein bars, an emergency blanket, thin and silver, and a phone, old, prepaid, with a single contact saved under the name D. She sat down on the cold floor with her back against the wall and her hands over her belly, and she breathed. Her contractions had begun 40 minutes ago. She had not told Dongchul when she called him because she needed him focused on logistics, not guilt, and guilt would have paralyzed him. His voice, when he answered on the second ring, was the flat voice of a man reciting facts because emotion had no room left. "The door combination is 7419, he said. "Guard rotation passes every 6 hours. Last pass was 20 minutes ago. The nearest road north is 300 meters. You can flag a taxi from there." A pause. "I'm sorry." Ha-yeon looked at the water containers. She looked at the phone. "Sorry is not enough," she said, "but it will have to do for now. What is the address I'm going to?" He texted it before the call ended. She memorized it before the phone died. She waited 4 hours in that room, timing the guard rotation he had given her, managing the contractions that were coming faster now, wrapping the emergency blanket around her shoulders, and focusing on the single task of remaining conscious and calm. The carbon dioxide in a sealed room accumulates slowly. She could not stay, but she could not move until the guard had passed. At 3 a.m., she stood. She entered the combination. She pushed the door. The cold night air of Uijeongbu hit her like something alive, and for one moment, she simply stood in it, breathing, with a dead phone battery in her pocket and 3 babies pressing urgently against the walls of her body. Then she walked north. She flagged a taxi 8 minutes later. The driver looked at her, enormous belly, concrete dust still in her hair, the emergency blanket still clutched at her shoulders, and opened his mouth. "Drive," she said. "I'll give you the address. I'll explain nothing. Drive." He drove. Dr. Yoon Chae-soo had not slept properly in 4 years. This was the consequence of running an unofficial clinic in Mapo for people who needed medical care they could not seek anywhere official. People whose existence was inconvenient to powerful men. People whose injuries would trigger questions that dangerous people had already answered for them. He had lost his hospital license 4 years ago when he refused to falsify a cause of death report for an Iron Veil victim. He had been given a choice: sign the document or lose everything. He had refused. He had lost everything. He had rebuilt quietly. The clinic was small, tucked behind a dry goods shop, accessible through a narrow back corridor that most people would walk past without noticing. It was equipped, by any reasonable medical standard, for far more than its appearance suggested. Yoon had made sure of this. The Iron Veil produced a specific kind of patient, and he had long ago decided that when the next one arrived, he would be ready. He opened his door at 4:30 a.m. to find her on his step. 7 months pregnant. Concrete dust. The remnants of active labor visible in every line of her body. He asked no questions. He took her inside. The delivery lasted 90 minutes. It was early, and it was dangerous, and it was conducted with the focused precision of a man who had spent 4 years preparing for exactly this. 3 babies, 2 girls, 1 boy. Small, weeks early, born into a world that had tried to prevent them, but alive. All 3 alive. Yoon documented everything. This was his reflex, the reflex of a man who had once been destroyed for failing to document. He photographed Ha-yeon's injuries, the bruising on her arms, the oxygen deprivation markers in her blood work, the evidence of stress labor in a sealed environment. He recorded the date, the time, the birth weights, the circumstances as the patient described them, in his careful physician's hand. He did not know, as he wrote, that this record would become the cornerstone of a criminal case 3 years later. He simply knew that truth required witnesses, and that he was the only one available. Ha-yeon lay on the recovery cot with 3 impossibly small people in a row beside her, and named them Kang Seo-ah, Kang Seo-jun, Kang Seo-ri. She gave them the Kang name deliberately. She lay in a clinic in Mapo, 24 hours removed from a concrete chamber where her husband had left her to die, and she gave her children the name of the man who had done it, because that name was their evidence, and she intended to use it. Yoon looked at her when she said the family name. He said nothing. "I know," she said quietly. "I know exactly what I'm doing." He believed her. 2 years passed, not quietly. There is no quiet in the life of a woman raising infant triplets alone in a 2-room apartment in Incheon, while simultaneously constructing a legal case against a criminal empire. But invisibly, carefully, with the specific discipline of a person who understands that the timing of revelation matters as much as the revelation itself. Ha-yeon had sent her father a package before the night of the burial. 2 weeks before, when the unfinished sentences in Jae-won's behavior had solidified from suspicion into certainty. An encrypted drive. A handwritten note. "Keep this. Open it only if you don't hear from me for 30 days. Her father, Professor Seo Byung-kil, opened it on day 31. He sat in his study in Daejeon, a man who had spent his life with literature, and read documents that described the financial structure of a criminal organization written in his daughter's careful hand, and he wept. And then he did what she had raised him to do. He contacted the law school acquaintance, whose address was also in the package. That acquaintance was a junior associate at a law firm in Seoul. The firm's name was Han and Partners. The chain of contact reached attorney Han Mi-reo 14 months after the burial. In the 14 months before that contact, Ha-yeon had lived under a false identity arranged by Dong-chul, who had stayed within the Iron Veil structure, because leaving would trigger exactly the kind of investigation that would find her before she was ready, and who had maintained sporadic, encrypted contact with her from within the organization. He was quietly dismantling from the inside. He fed her information. Structure, personnel, financial routing, the specific vulnerabilities in the Iron Veil's legal defenses. He did this because guilt had calcified into purpose, and because he had decided, sometime in the 2nd month after the burial, that he did not particularly care whether the end of this road freed him or destroyed him, only that it reached the end. Ha-yeon, meanwhile, worked as a freelance document translator. Her academic language skills turned to income. Her evenings turned to meticulous reconstruction of everything she had documented across 3 years of marriage. She raised 3 children who had arrived in the world early and furious, and had apparently decided to compensate for that with personalities that filled every room they entered. COA announced herself at volume and expected the world to listen. Seo Jun was quiet and watchful, with his mother's eyes, and her habit of noticing things other people missed. Seo Ri, born last and smallest, had spent 2 years establishing that smallness was entirely irrelevant to ambition. Ha-yeon looked at them every morning and felt the particular kind of love that is indistinguishable from resolve. She was not waiting. She was building. Attorney Han Mi-reo had left the state prosecution service 7 years ago after watching a man she had spent 18 months building a case against walk free on a procedural technicality that his legal team had engineered over weeks of careful obstruction. She had stood in the corridor outside the courtroom and understood, with the clarity of a person whose fundamental assumptions have just been surgically removed, that the system she had entered to serve was not built to deliver justice to the people who most required it. She had built Han and partners around a single principle. The case against a powerful man cannot have a single weak point. Because one weak point is all a team of expensive lawyers needs to pull, and the whole structure collapses. She traveled to Incheon alone on a Tuesday in October, 14 months after contact had first been made. She expected a survivor. She found a strategist. Ha-yeon spread everything on the kitchen table. The encrypted files from her 3 years of documentation. Yoon's medical records, the injuries, the blood work, the birth documentation, organized in chronological order. A typed timeline, 40 pages, of every financial anomaly and behavioral signal she had observed during the marriage. A handwritten account of the night of the burial, precise and sequential, that read less like a trauma testimony and more like a legal deposition. Mi-reo read all of it in silence. The children were in the next room. She could hear them. The particular chaos of toddlers who had decided that bedtime was a suggestion rather than a rule. When she finished, she looked up. "You've been building a case," Mi-reo said. "I've been building a weapon," Ha-yeon said. "I need you to aim it." Mi-reo asked one question before she agreed. "What do you want? Criminal charges, civil action, public exposure?" Ha-yeon's answer was immediate and total. "All 3, in that order, and then I want his father." Mi-reo said yes. What followed was 18 months of legal architecture that was, in its own way, as cold and precise as anything Jae-won had ever built. Mi-reo constructed 4 simultaneous legal layers that could not all be dismissed or delayed at once. The specific strategy required for a case against someone with Jae-won's resources. The first layer, criminal attempted murder charges against Jae-won and Elder Kang Byung-soo, supported by Dong-chul's testimony and Yoon's medical records and the forensic evidence Mi-reo had arranged to document at the Uijeongbu site without triggering any premature official investigation. The second layer, criminal conspiracy charges against Oh Seung-hae, the Mistress, now the public face of the Kang Foundation's charity arm, now photographed weekly at children's hospital openings, sourced from Dong-chul's testimony and from recordings obtained through a source that would not become fully clear until the morning of the filing. The third layer, civil fraud charges relating to Ha-yeon's legal death declaration, which had been filed 18 months after her disappearance while she was alive, which meant that every asset transfer and every estate decision made in her name, since that declaration was fraudulent and recoverable. The fourth layer, the children. The triplets' birth certificates, their DNA, and the documented forensic circumstances of their birth constituted independent criminal evidence of what had been done to their mother, and of the ongoing legal fraud of their non-existence. Mi-reo filed all 4 layers simultaneously on a Tuesday morning. A coordinated media release was timed for 60 minutes after the court filings were confirmed. Enough time for the legal system to process the filing, not enough time for anyone to suppress it before the public knew. While Hayan built in silence, Kang Jae-won built in plain sight. This was the particular obscenity of the 3 years after the burial, that he had simply continued, expanded even. Hayan had been declared legally dead 18 months after her disappearance. His legal team had managed the process with smooth efficiency. He and Oh Seung-hae were publicly together, though not yet married, a detail that quietly irritated Seung-hae in ways she had learned not to express directly. Kang Industries appeared on the covers of business magazines. The Iron Veil absorbed 2 smaller rival networks. The Kang Foundation, its charitable arm, run by Seung-hae, with camera-ready benevolence, funded children's hospitals and education programs and public events that were reported glowingly by the press. The irony of the woman who helped bury a pregnant woman now funding children's hospitals was not visible to anyone who did not know the full story. Seung-hae was not happy. This was important to understand, not because unhappiness earned her sympathy, but because it made her dangerous in a specific and ultimately useful way. She had pursued Jae-won for 3 years before the marriage, and for 3 years during it, and for 3 years after it, with the conviction of someone who had confused the wanting of a thing for the deserving of it. She had persuaded herself that Hayan was an obstacle rather than a victim. She had persuaded herself that what was done had been necessary. She had constructed an entire internal narrative in which she was not a person who had helped arrange the burial of a 7 months pregnant woman, but rather a person who had refused to let a better story be stopped by an inconvenient one. Now that she had everything she had arranged to acquire, she was discovering that Jae-won did not change for the person beside him. He was cold to Ha-yeon because he was cold. He was cold to Seung-hae for exactly the same reason. The apartment was beautiful. The social calendar was full. And she went to bed every night beside a man who had never once looked at her with the warmth she had committed a monstrous act to earn. She began to drink privately. She began to talk, too much, too specifically, in the late evenings when the wine had lowered her careful guard. She talked to her personal assistant, a young woman named Cho Yeon, who had been quietly recording these conversations for 8 months on behalf of an investigative journalist named Kim Tae-yang. Tae-yang was 29 and had spent 18 months following a different thread entirely. Financial anomalies in the Kang Foundation's charitable accounts, a pattern consistent with systematic money laundering that his instincts told him was too structured to be accidental. He had approached Cho Yeon about the foundation's accounting. He had discovered, to his considerable alarm, that there was something far larger beneath it. Seung-hae's recorded conversations became layer 2 of Mirio's case. Tae-yang's financial investigation became its own parallel weapon. Neither of them knew yet exactly what they were aiming at. But on a Tuesday morning, 60 minutes after Mirio's court filings were confirmed, they would understand completely. Kang Jae-won was in a board meeting when his chief of staff entered without knocking. In 12 years, this had not happened. The chief of staff placed a phone on the table face up, slid it to the chairman without speaking, and stood with the expression of a man who has delivered the message and intends to be nowhere nearby when it detonates. The alert on the screen read, Kang Industries chairman accused of burying pregnant wife alive. Wife alive. Triplets confirm survival. Criminal filing confirmed at Seoul Central District Court. The boardroom was silent. All eyes, despite every professional instinct, moved to Jae-won. He read it once. He read it again. Then he looked up at the glass wall of the conference room, through which his assistant was visible, white-faced, holding 3 separate ringing phones simultaneously. Behind her, through the building's lobby windows, the first press van was pulling into the street. He stood. He buttoned his jacket. He excused himself from the meeting in the measured, unhurried voice of a man who had never once been outsmarted and was not willing to visibly acknowledge that this was now happening. He walked to his private office. He called his legal team. Then he called his father. Elder Kang Byung-soo did not answer. Elder Kang was, at that precise moment, sitting in his study watching the breaking news on television. He was 68 years old. He had built the Iron Veil over 40 years of careful, merciless accumulation. He had outlasted rivals and prosecutors and investigations and restructurings. He had given the order. It was he who had told his son 3 years and 4 months ago. A divorce she survives. A disappearance she doesn't. Because Hayan's documenting habits and her academic family connections had made her, in his assessment, too dangerous to simply release. He had never in 40 years found himself without a next move. He sat completely still and watched the television and found himself there now. Across Seoul, Oh Seung-hee was being photographed for the Kang Foundation's quarterly charity feature when the alert appeared on her phone. She saw Ha-yeon's face, alive, composed, photographed outside Mirio's office the previous evening for the press package, and the charitable smile the photographer had arranged on her face simply stopped working. He captured it on camera. The precise moment the architecture of 3 years of self-deception collapsed. She walked out of the shoot without speaking. She went to her car. She called her personal lawyer, the individual one, not the Kang family team, because Mirio had filed in a jurisdiction that prevented shared legal representation in cases with multiple defendants, and heard, in his first sentence, the full extent of what had been filed against her specifically. Criminal conspiracy to commit murder. Criminal conspiracy to commit fraud. Conspiracy against a pregnant woman. An aggravated charge under Korean criminal law. She was not protected by the Kang family infrastructure. She was not adjacent to Jaewon's defense. She was alone in a legal structure that had been built, with precise intention, to isolate exactly her. She sat in her car for a long time. Then she did the thing that would matter most, though she did not know it yet. Ha-yeon held the press conference the morning after the filing in the atrium of Han Mi-reo's building. She walked in holding Seo-a's hand. Seo-jun was carried by Dr. Yoon, who stood as a witness. Seo-ri held Mi-reo's hand. 3 children, 3 years old, in a room full of cameras and journalists and the compressed energy of a story that had been held in silence for 3 years and was now, finally, detonating. The room went quiet when she walked in. Not the performed quiet of people waiting for a performance. The actual quiet of people confronted with something they had not fully processed yet. 3 small children. A woman who had been declared legally dead and was standing, visibly and undeniably, alive. Ha-yeon stood at the prepared podium and read her statement. She did not raise her voice. She did not perform grief or anger or triumph. She described what had happened. The car, the construction site, the chamber, the door, the supplies, the phone, in sequential and factual language, and the very absence of emotional performance made it more devastating than any amount of tears could have been. This was not a woman presenting her wounds. This was a woman presenting a record. She described the encrypted drives she had prepared before the burial and what they contained. She described Park Dong-chul's role, what he had done, both in placing her there and in leaving her the means of survival. And she stated clearly that his full cooperation with the prosecution was documented and confirmed. And then she looked at the cameras. These 3 people, she said, were born in a sealed concrete room in the sub-basement of a Kang Industries construction site because their father and his father decided that their mother's life was an inconvenience. They have spent 3 years in hiding because their existence is evidence of a crime. Today, they stop hiding. Today, they are the evidence. The room was silent for 3 full seconds. Then it was not silent at all. 2 days later, Park Dong-chul walked into Seoul Central District Court and provided 4 hours of uninterrupted testimony. He had been waiting for this for 3 years. He had rehearsed it 10,000 times in the privacy of his own conscience. The flat, detailed account of a man who had spent 20 years doing terrible things in service of a criminal organization and had finally, in the sub-basement of an unfinished building at 11 o'clock at night, reached the line he could not cross and could not uncross. He described the order. He described who gave it and the exact words used. He described the construction of the chamber, the supplies he had placed, the night he drove Hayan to the site, the sound of the lock engaging. He described the 20 minutes he had sat in his car half a kilometer away, unable to drive further, and the minimum act of conscience he had finally managed. The phone, the code, the directions. "I left her enough to survive," he said. "I told myself that was mercy. It was not mercy. It was the smallest possible version of a conscience. But it was enough for her." His immunity arrangement, negotiated by Mirio over 6 months, had been processed the week before. He was free of the iron veil's remaining structure. He was, for the first time in 20 years, accountable to no one except the record of what he had done. He felt, not relief, but a kind of exhausted completion, like a debt finally acknowledged, if not erased. 10 days into the public firestorm, Oh Seung-hae broke. Mireille had calculated this possibility, not certainty. Seung-hae was many things, but she had always, in the years of documented observation, been a person with a high tolerance for her own rationalizations. The specific conditions required for her to break were unusual. She had to be genuinely alone, genuinely isolated from the protection she had assumed would surround her, and she had to be confronted with the specific detail she had most successfully avoided confronting, that the man she had destroyed another woman to possess had never, not once, been worth it. Those conditions had been present for 10 days. On day 10, Seung-hae contacted a prosecutor directly, not through her lawyer, in a move so legally inadvisable that Mi-ryo, hearing of it afterward, sat in her office for a moment with an expression she rarely allowed herself, something close to satisfaction. What Seung-hae provided in that call, before her lawyer forcibly terminated it, was the last piece that Mi-ryo had needed but had not been certain she could obtain. She confirmed Elder Kang's original instruction. His exact words, which she had heard because she had been present in Jae-won's office the night the decision was made. A divorce, she survives. A disappearance, she doesn't. She confirmed that Jae-won had initially resisted. This detail was not mitigating. It was damning in a way that was almost elegant. It meant Jae-won had known it was wrong. He had looked at the moral line directly, had hesitated, and had crossed it anyway. Because his father had told him to. Because the architecture required it. Because Kangmen did not allow inconvenience to outlive its usefulness. The prosecution added Elder Kang's recorded statement to the evidence file. Elder Kang's last viable defense collapsed. He had spent 40 years making certain that no single person possessed enough of the picture to destroy him. He had divided information, loyalty, and knowledge across a dozen people, none of whom held enough individually to constitute a threat. But Hayan had been building her picture for 3 years from within his organization, through a man whose guilt had converted him into the most effective informant the prosecution had ever worked with, and she had waited until the picture was complete before she moved. He had underestimated her because she was a woman his son had married for presentation. He had underestimated her because academic families produced scholars, not strategists. He had underestimated her the way powerful men have always underestimated the specific intelligence of people they believe they have successfully erased. The error was total. The cost was everything. The trial lasted 11 days. Kang Jae-won's legal team was among the most expensive and experienced in Korea. They were also, for the first time in their professional relationship with the Kang family, without a workable strategy. Mireille had closed every procedural exit. The evidence was not circumstantial. It was physical, forensic, medical, and testimony-based simultaneously, layered across 4 legal actions that could not all be dismissed at once. Kim Tae-yang's financial exposé, running in parallel across every major media outlet, had poisoned the public environment so thoroughly that any defense motion that might theoretically succeed in isolation created an immediate public backlash that triggered further investigation. Ha-yeon testified for 6 hours on the 3rd day. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She described 3 years of marriage, the documented anomalies she had recorded, the night of the burial, the delivery of her children in the concrete chamber, and the 3 years of reconstruction with a testimony so detailed and internally consistent that the defense team's cross-examination produced nothing of value, and several moments of visible discomfort. At one point, the defense attorney suggested that the supplies left in the chamber indicated the intent was confinement rather than murder. Ha-yeon looked at him. A sealed concrete room with no ventilation and a 7-month pregnant woman produces carbon dioxide accumulation within 12 hours, she said. The medical toxicology report from Dr. Yoon, submitted as Exhibit 14, documents the CO2 levels in my blood at the time of rescue. Either the defense team would like to argue that slow asphyxiation is not murder, or they would like to withdraw the question. The defense team withdrew the question. It was, in some ways, the moment the trial ended, though 6 more days of proceedings remained. On the 11th day, the verdicts arrived. Kang Jae-won. Guilty. Attempted murder with child endangerment aggravation. Fraud and criminal conspiracy. 18 years. Elder Kang Byung-soo. Guilty. Criminal conspiracy to commit murder. Organized crime leadership charges. 16 years. At 68, this was functionally the rest of his life. Oh Seung-hae. Guilty. Criminal conspiracy. 6 years. Reduced partially by the prosecutorial cooperation that she had, in her psychological collapse, stumbled into providing, though not as much as she had hoped. The prosecutor had taken what she offered and given back what the law required, and not a day more. In the press gallery, Kim Tae-yang wrote his final piece on the Kang Empire's collapse in the Notes app on his phone, while the verdicts were still being read, because he had learned 3 months ago that the anomalous sub-basement investment in the Uijeongbu construction site was not money laundering, but something far worse, and the story he had originally chased had become something he would spend the rest of his career unable to fully process. He filed it anyway. That was his job. Ha-yeon stood on the steps of Seoul Central District Court with her children and her attorney as the verdicts were delivered to the press outside. She did not celebrate. This was noticed by every journalist present. The absence of visible triumph in a woman who had every right to it. She stood still, with Seo-ae holding her left hand, and Seo-ri holding her right, and Seo-jun standing in front of her, with both small hands gripping the fabric of her coat. And she looked at the city that had buried her alive and watched her survive it. Mireille stood beside her. Dr. Yoon was there, and at the edge of the gathered crowd, not beside her, because he did not have the right to stand beside her, and he knew it, and he had not asked, stood Park Dong-chul. He was there because he had needed to see the end of the thing he had partially begun. He stood with his hands in his coat pockets and his eyes on the courthouse steps, and when the verdict was announced, his expression did not change. Because a man who has spent 3 years waiting for a particular moment tends to have fully experienced it long before the moment arrives. Ha-Yan's father arrived late. He had driven from Daejeon and hit traffic, and he arrived at a half-run with his coat still unbuttoned and his face doing the particular complex work that faces do when relief and grief and love all arrive together. And he found his daughter on those courthouse steps and held her for a long time without saying anything. The cameras photographed this. It ran on the front pages the next morning. A daughter and her father, 3 small children pressed against their legs, in front of a courthouse in Seoul. A journalist found her way through the crowd with a microphone. "What do you want people to take from this story?" Ha-Yan was quiet for a moment, not composing her answer. She had known what she would say if asked for a long time. She was simply deciding whether the moment was right for it. She decided it was. "That survival is not passive," she said. "That documentation is power. That the people who try to erase you are counting on you to cooperate with your own erasure. And that 3 children born in the dark are still born. And they carry the light with them, whether anyone planned for that or not." She took her children's hands and walked down the steps. "If this story stayed with you, if Ha-Yan's survival, her precision, her refusal to cooperate with her own erasure stayed with you, then you belong in our family at K-Elove. Subscribe now, tap the notification bell, and leave a comment below telling us which moment hit you hardest. Because we read every single one. New stories every week. We'll see you in the next one." A Sunday morning. The apartment is larger now. It is in a building with a garden, one of those quiet residential towers in Western Seoul where children are allowed to run in the courtyard on weekends and the neighbors are the kind of people who learn each other's names. It is not luxurious. It is warm, which is entirely different. The civil settlement from the fraud case involving Ha-Yan's fraudulent death declaration had returned to her every asset that Kang Industries had held in her name across 3 years of fraudulent probate, plus substantial damages. She had used none of it on extravagance. She had used it on permanence. SEO-A is explaining something to her grandfather with the forceful authority of a 4-year-old who has recently learned a new fact and intends to deploy it continuously until the world has fully absorbed it. Her grandfather, Professor Seo Byung-kil, who drove from Daejeon every Sunday now, who had stopped calling ahead because the door was always open, is listening with the focused attention of a man who has decided that nothing in the world is more important than this specific child's specific thoughts. Seo-jun is in the corner of the couch with a picture book, reading. He has been reading since he was 3.5 in the particular quiet, intense way that suggests he is not reading so much as conducting a private investigation into the material. He has his mother's eyes. He notices things. Seo-ri has drawn something, a large, ambitious drawing in many colors, and is presenting it to Dr. Yoon with the gravity of a curator presenting a masterwork to a collector. Dr. Yoon visits on Sundays. He has been visiting on Sundays for a year. He appraises the drawing with appropriate formal seriousness and provides feedback that is taken extremely seriously and immediately incorporated into the next drawing. Ha-Yan stands in the kitchen and makes tea. Her phone buzzes on the counter. Mi Rio. Jaewon's appeal denied. 3rd time. Final. Ha-Yan reads it. She sets the phone down. She does not feel what she expected to feel at this news. Not triumph, not the particular sharp satisfaction of a long-held promise fulfilled. She feels something quieter. The feeling of a chapter that has been formally closed. She picks up the tea and carries it to the living room. She sits among her people, her father, her children, the doctor who caught them when they were born into darkness and has been present for every Sunday since, and she drinks it slowly. Outside the window, Seoul goes about its Sunday morning, enormous and indifferent, and full of stories at every stage of their telling. Some just beginning, some mid-collapse, some quietly finding their endings in garden apartments in the western city on winter mornings. Ha Yan's story has found its ending, not because everything is perfect, not because 3 years in hiding, or the memory of a concrete room, or the specific damage done to 3 small children by the circumstances of their arrival into this world undoes itself with a verdict and a garden. Damage is real. It stays. She knows this, but she is here and he is not. And the 3 small people who were born in a concrete chamber beneath an abandoned construction site in the middle of a cold Uijeongbu night are sitting in a Sunday morning in Seoul, alive and loud and warm and entirely, completely, irreversibly here. COA says something that makes her grandfather laugh. Seo-ri demands that Dr. Yoon consider a second drawing. Seo-jun looks up from his book for a moment, looks at his mother across the room, and then looks back down. Ha-yan drinks her tea. That is enough. That is everything.